A simple woman wearing an old baseball cap, worn-out sneakers, and carrying a faded backpack quietly walked into a luxury bank branch in the heart of Manhattan. Within minutes she was suspected of being a fraudster, severely insulted, and even had the bank manager call the police to handle her. But what no one knew at that moment was that this woman was actually the most powerful figure at that bank, and what she did next will leave you stunned. Stay tuned until the end of the story, because this emotional and powerful turnaround will surely touch your heart. Amid the bustling and elegant surroundings of Manhattan's largest bank, a middle-aged black woman slowly walked in, immediately drawing attention not for her noble appearance but for her simplicity, which seemed strikingly out of place against everything around her. As she passed through the glass revolving door, the cool and luxurious atmosphere inside the bank seemed to contrast completely with her humble and modest appearance. A few employees near the door glanced at her wearily, while other well-dressed customers couldn't hide their curiosity, even casting judgmental looks. Mary Collins paused for a moment, gently adjusting her cap to cover more of her face, then moved to take a number for herself. In her own quiet way, she slowly made her way to the waiting area, finding an empty seat to sit, calmly observing the space around her. No one there knew that her quiet presence was about to shake the most prestigious bank in Manhattan that morning. From the moment she entered, Mary could clearly feel the cold indifference from the staff. A few customers and bank employees looked at her with suspicion and discomfort, assuming that she didn't belong in such a luxurious place. The air quickly became thick, as though her presence was an unwelcome stain in the glossy and expensive space of the bank. At the front desk, a young employee named Jessica Carter, with her perfectly curled golden hair and expensive business attire, shot a look of irritation at Mary that was impossible to miss. Jessica furrowed her brow, exchanged a few whispered words with a colleague. Then both of them let out a small laugh, their eyes repeatedly darting toward Mary with malice. Mary remained silent, her gaze fixed on the number ticket in her hand, pretending not to notice. At the corner near the door, a tall security guard stood with his arms crossed, scanning Mary from head to toe, his expression cold but betraying an over-the-top vigilance in his eyes. A woman dressed like Mary surely couldn't have any legitimate reason to be in this bank. Only trouble was lurking. As Mary approached the waiting area, she accidentally brushed against the luxurious leather chair. A middle-aged woman seated nearby quickly pulled her Louis Vuitton handbag closer to her body, as if Mary might pose a threat at any moment. She shot Mary a contemptuous glance, then turned to the man next to her and whispered just loudly enough for Mary to hear, "I don't know how someone like her even gets in here." Mary heard every word clearly, but she chose to stay silent. Her heart felt a small invisible wound, a sharp ache deep inside. Old memories from her childhood came rushing back, familiar and painful. She took a deep breath, striving to stay calm, knowing that she wasn't here to argue or make a scene. Her true purpose was far more profound than that, and she wouldn't let those scornful looks shake her determination. Mary glanced around once more, discreetly observing each face, every gesture. Her gaze lingered longer on Jessica Carter, who was still laughing and chatting inappropriately with her colleague, although Mary was completely anonymous to them now. In just a short while, these people would understand one crucial thing: the attitude they showed today would come at a price they wouldn't soon forget. As Mary continued to discreetly watch Jessica and her colleague, she silently observed the attitudes of the bank staff. She soon realized a painful truth: black customers, those dressed simply and especially the elderly, were treated with indifference and disrespect. At the counter a few meters away from Mary, an elderly black man with graying hair and a trembling voice was trying to inquire about his modest savings. However, the female employee in front of him didn't even bother to look up from her computer screen. She responded with curt, impatient remarks, as if she were speaking to an annoying child, leaving the old man looking visibly confused and embarrassed. To Mary's left, another black woman dressed in a janitor's uniform, with tired hands still trembling from exhaustion, quietly told the receptionist that she was unable to operate the number-taking machine. In response, Jessica shot her an indifferent, irritated glance and said, "Ma'am, the instructions are right there. Anyone can do it. Please handle it yourself." The woman could only lower her head in apology, her eyes red from humiliation and shame. Feeling the scrutinizing gazes of the other customers around her, Mary clenched her fists lightly, a feeling of discomfort and sadness rising in her heart. Just then her attention was drawn to a small elderly woman with snowy white hair, awkwardly standing in front of the number-taking machine. The elderly woman, confused, had shaky hands as she pressed random buttons on the screen, but received no ticket. A few employees nearby noticed but didn't bother to help. Without hesitation, Mary stood up and gently walked over to the woman. "Excuse me, may I help you with the ticket?" she asked. The elderly woman looked up at Mary, her pale blue eyes showing gratitude. "Thank you, dear. I'm not familiar with these machines." Mary smiled softly, took the ticket for the elderly woman and led her to a nearby seat. Those around them, including Jessica Carter, were now watching and following Mary's every move with a mix of surprise and scrutiny. Jessica raised an eyebrow, smirking mockingly, and leaned toward her colleague, speaking just loud enough for Mary to hear, "They really belong together, don't they? Poor people just know how to bother others." Mary heard every word clearly, but she silently returned to her seat, her face maintaining its calm expression. Inside, her determination had only grown stronger. That small act was just the beginning, because very soon everyone who thought they could look down on others in this bank would learn a lesson they would never forget from the simple woman they were laughing at today. Mary quietly returned to her seat, her gaze still fixed on the elderly woman she had just helped, a feeling both familiar and heartbreaking flickering in her heart. It wasn't by accident that Mary was here today, dressed in a way that made her easily dismissed and ridiculed. Behind this seemingly ordinary simplicity, she was actually Mary Collins, the powerful and influential CEO of the most prestigious bank in Manhattan. Mary's quiet presence this morning was the result of a strong decision she had made after receiving numerous letters and emails from black customers and everyday working-class people. These letters shared a common painful message: they were always treated with contempt by the bank staff, treated with suspicion and disregard, sometimes even publicly humiliated simply because of their appearance or clothing which didn't meet the bank's unspoken standards of wealth. Mary clearly remembered one of the most recent letters, written by a woman named Angela Jenkins, a single mother who worked as a janitor in a nearby building. In the letter, Angela shared that she had cried at the counter when a bank employee had called her a beggar when she sought a small loan to pay for her son's tuition. Mary had read the letter over and over again, each time feeling a deep sadness, as though she were witnessing her own story from decades ago. The past rushed back like a tidal wave, bringing with it vivid images of the difficult years Mary had endured. She had once been a girl growing up in Harlem, where the poor streets and dilapidated houses bore witness to her challenging childhood. She vividly remembered the feeling of being chased away by staff at luxury stores when she was young, the disdainful looks from people around her whenever her mother, a hard-working janitor, brought her into a bank to deposit a few modest savings. Because of those painful memories, Mary had vowed that when she became the head of the bank she would do everything in her power to change the discriminatory attitude that so deeply troubled her. Yet what hurt Mary the most now was that despite all her efforts to implement new policies and carefully train her staff, the complaints kept coming, as though everything she tried to change was just a surface-level fix, and the prejudices and contempt still simmered within many employees, especially people like Jessica Carter. That's why Mary decided that today she would no longer sit quietly in her office. Instead, she chose a different approach, disguising herself to truly experience the attitudes of the staff towards customers firsthand, so that she could witness with her own eyes who truly deserved their job and who was merely using their uniform to satisfy their own vanity and personal biases. Sitting quietly in the waiting area, Mary knew that in just a few moments she would begin the next steps of her plan, and when her true identity was revealed, those arrogant people would have to face a lesson they could never have imagined. Sitting quietly in the waiting area, Mary's gaze briefly wandered through the polished glass windows of the bank, looking out at the bustling traffic rushing along the street amid the dazzling surroundings of downtown Manhattan. Her heart was unexpectedly pulled back to a distant past, to the narrow streets and old houses of Harlem, a place she once called home. The memories of her difficult childhood came flooding back, each fragment of her past unfolding like a slow-motion film before her eyes. Harlem, where she grew up, was nothing like the place she sat in now. It was a poor neighborhood with old apartments, cracked walls stained with dampness, and streets littered with trash. Life here had never been easy, and for Mary it was even harder than for other children her age. Both of Mary's parents were working class. Her father, Joseph Collins, was a construction worker, spending his days exposed to the harsh sun and cold rain. Mary clearly remembered her father coming home every night with his clothes covered in cement dust, his hands rough with calluses and his shoulders heavy. After a long day of hard labor, despite being exhausted, he never complained, not once. In Mary's memories, he always smiled gently when he came home, no matter what challenges he faced that day. Outside the construction site, her mother, Loretta Collins, worked as a janitor at a local school. Her job was to clean every day, a grueling task that few people valued. Mary had often seen her mother scrubbing filthy restrooms and sweeping long empty hallways well into the night. The image of her mother returning home at midnight, her hands, rough hair matted with sweat, eyes tired yet still shining with hope, always filled Mary with both sorrow and admiration. Though her parents worked tirelessly, their family still lacked so much. There were nights when their meal consisted of old bread and a can of soup. On cold winter nights, Mary would cling to an old worn-out blanket, feeling the cold draft sneak through the gaps in the old windows, quietly hearing her parents' sighs from the room next door. Those memories were etched deeply into her mind like invisible scars that time could never erase. The material deprivation was hard enough, but the emotional toll that Mary and her family endured was even more painful. From a young age, she felt the discrimination and prejudice of those around her. One time when Mary went with her mother to buy a new dress for her 8th birthday, the store clerk coldly told them, "We don't serve people like you here." Her mother said nothing, just gently took Mary's hand and silently walked out of the store. But Mary, just 8 years old at the time, cried all the way home. Another painful memory was when she went with her father to the bank to withdraw a small amount of money from his meager savings. The bank was crowded that day, and her father, in his old work clothes still covered in cement dust, awkwardly approached the counter. The bank employee looked at him with disdain and asked rude questions, as if she didn't believe a man like him could have a savings account. Her father, who was always proud and strong, had to lower his head and apologized to the bank employee for not filling out the form correctly. Mary stood by, tears streaming down her face, unable to stop them as she watched the strongest man she knew being disrespected and looked down upon. It was in that moment that Mary promised herself she would never let anyone disrespect her family again. She understood that only success and status could change her circumstances and protect those she loved, and from that day on, Mary always reminded herself that her life would not be defined by poverty. She decided she would work harder than anyone else to rise above, to escape the vicious cycle of discrimination and injustice. From then on, despite the difficult circumstances, Mary persevered in her studies. She seized every small opportunity, every old book she could borrow from the library, every hour spent studying under the street lights when the power was out because her family couldn't afford to pay the bills. With her strong will and exceptional intelligence, she earned a scholarship to a top university in New York, slowly rising, leaving behind the hardships of her Harlem childhood. Those memories had never faded in Mary's mind, though she was now the powerful CEO of Manhattan's most prestigious bank. The tough years of her childhood were the foundation that kept her humble and empathetic. She knew she had to use her power to change perceptions, to eliminate the prejudices that still lingered in society, and especially within her own bank. Today, as Mary disguised herself as an ordinary woman and entered the bank, she knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just here as a leader gathering insight. She was here to make a strong statement that she had never forgotten where she came from and had never lost her empathy for the vulnerable in society. Mary looked around the bank once more, her gaze growing stronger and more determined than ever. Now, with power and strength in her hands, she knew it was time to make the truth clear, to return justice to those who had been looked down upon, just like her parents had been so many years ago. In just a few minutes, everyone in this bank, especially those who arrogantly looked down on others, would have to face a truth they couldn't possibly have imagined, and Mary, deep in her heart, knew that this would be the first step in fulfilling the quiet promise she made as an 8-year-old girl. Through tears and fierce hope under the streetlight in the Harlem neighborhood all those years ago, the painful memories of her childhood slowly faded in Mary's heart as the cold, impatient voice from the bank's counter rang out clearly through the intercom, calling the next number. Mary flinched slightly, glanced down at the ticket in her hand, and realized that it was her turn. Calmly, she stood up and made her way to the counter where the employee Jessica Carter sat, her expression full of arrogance, her eyes scanning the computer screen without bothering to look at the person in front of her. Jessica Carter was well known at this branch for her haughty attitude and her ability to judge customers by their appearance alone. With her glossy blonde hair styled in soft curls, alluring red lips, and a sparkling designer watch on her wrist, Jessica prided herself on her ability to read people. To her, a quick glance was enough to determine whether a customer deserved her time and attention, and clearly, the moment she saw the simple woman before her, Jessica immediately categorized Mary as someone not worthy of proper service. "Hello," Mary said politely, gently placing her ID and bank card on the glass counter in front of Jessica. "I would like to withdraw $72,000 from my personal account." Mary's voice was soft yet clear, just loud enough for Jessica and a few nearby customers to hear. Immediately, Jessica paused all her movements and looked up for the first time since Mary entered. Her eyes widened with suspicion. Her gaze quickly swept over Mary from head to toe, reassessing the shabby clothes, worn-out shoes, and the faded baseball cap. A half smile appeared on Jessica's lips, one that carried both mockery and irritation, as if she believed she was being wasted on an unnecessary joke. "You want to withdraw how much?" Jessica repeated, emphasizing each word as though she couldn't believe what she had just heard. "72,000. Mary calmly repeated. Jessica raised an eyebrow, her attitude shifting from annoyance to challenge. She took Mary's card and ID, her fingers touching the papers as if afraid of getting them dirty. Jessica began entering the information into the computer, occasionally glancing at Mary with suspicion, almost certain something was wrong. The screen in front of her displayed the account details, balance, and previous transactions. Jessica immediately frowned, her doubts growing clearer. It was impossible for a person who dressed so poorly, even shabby, to have an account holding such a large amount of money. To Jessica, this made no sense, and there had to be something wrong. "Sorry, ma'am, I need to verify the information. Please wait a moment," Jessica said coldly, picking up the internal phone and immediately calling the bank manager's office. "Mr. Daniel Harris." Daniel Harris didn't take long to come out of his office. He appeared with his usual dignified demeanor, an expensive gray suit, a perfectly knotted dark red tie, carefully groomed graying hair, and an authoritative gaze that swept over the space. Daniel was a senior manager at this branch, famous within the company for his effective management and decisive attitude, but also known for maintaining a cold and unyielding distance from those he deemed unworthy of proper service. "What's the issue, Jessica?" Daniel approached Jessica, his eyes immediately shifting to Mary, as sharp as if he were assessing an unexpected foreign object invading his perfect world. Jessica leaned toward Mary, her voice deliberately lowering to increase the seriousness of the situation. "This woman wants to withdraw a very large sum of money from her personal account, but I suspect she is not the actual account holder. The amount in her account is far too large to match her appearance and behavior." Upon hearing this, Daniel immediately turned his gaze to Mary with Suspicion. His expression shifted from curiosity to mockery in an instant, as though he had already judged the situation. "Hello, Mrs. Collins," Daniel said, deliberately reading her name with a clear note of doubt. "You understand that this is a large transaction, and I'm sure you know that we need to verify this very carefully." Mary remained calm, responding to Daniel softly, "I completely understand, and I'm happy to provide any documents you require." Daniel smirked, his attitude now openly dripping with contempt. He looked Mary up and down once again, then turned to Jessica, speaking quietly but clearly enough for Mary to hear. "You're doing the right thing." "Jessica, looks like she doesn't know how thorough we are here. Keep checking carefully. I suspect these documents could be fake." Mary remained silent, trying to suppress the feeling of hurt as she heard those public insults. On the outside she maintained her composed and polite demeanor, but inside anger and disappointment began to rise strongly. She was not surprised by what was happening, because this was the exact reason she was here today. Daniel turned and walked away, his face smug, as if he had just completed the important task of protecting the bank's reputation and safety from a potential fraudster. With her managers backing, Jessica became even more confident, openly treating Mary with increasing disdain. "Please wait a little longer, we will verify your information," Jessica said in a cold tone, her eyes downcast at the computer screen, leaving Mary to stand in silence, subject to the skeptical and judgmental stares of the other customers around her. Mary took a deep breath and patiently stood there, but she knew very well that in just a moment the people who were looking at her with contempt and suspicion would have to face an entirely different truth, a truth that would not only make them reconsider their attitudes but also teach them a deep lesson about humanity and the true value of respect. The atmosphere inside the bank seemed to drop, an unusual silence enveloping the entire transaction area. As Daniel Harris returned, his face full of arrogance and self-satisfaction, as though he had just completed an important mission, his cold, sharp eye scanned the customers waiting in line, finally stopping, locking on to Mary with an expression that couldn't have been more full of contempt and mockery. Daniel approached, the sound of his polished leather shoes echoing coldly on the luxurious marble floor, as though emphasizing the power and important position he held. "Mrs. Collins, or whatever name you're using," Daniel began sarcastically, speaking loudly enough for everyone around to hear, "I think you should stop this little joke right here. Our bank is not a place for you to play this kind of fraud." His words were clear, each one like an invisible knife cutting through the silence, causing all the customers present to turn and look at Mary with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Several people began whispering, some scrutinizing the simple dressed black woman standing at the counter. Mary maintained her calm expression, trying to control the rising emotions within her. She spoke gently to Daniel, her tone still soft and polite. "I can understand your caution, Mr. Harris, but I assure you that all the documents I have provided are legitimate. You may verify them directly with the banking system to get a clearer picture." Daniel sneered, shaking his head as though hearing a laughable, absurd story. "Verified? Do you think I haven't done that already, man? The issue here isn't the paperwork. The issue is you. Someone like you." He paused, scanning Mary from head to toe once again. "How could you possibly have such a large sum of money? I'm sorry, but this is just too absurd." Jessica, standing behind Daniel, flashed a smug smile. She was clearly pleased with her superior's hard-handed and somewhat insulting treatment of the customer she considered a nuisance. Several other employees began to gather around, as if watching an interesting play unfold before them. A nearby customer whispered loud enough for those beside them to hear, "I never thought I'd see something like this in such a fancy bank." The remark made Daniel even more self-satisfied, believing he was doing the right thing to protect the bank's reputation and safety. "Mrs. Collins," Daniel continued with unmasked derision, "if you're truly innocent as you say, you wouldn't mind waiting for the police to come and check, would you?" The whispers around them immediately fell silent as the word police was emphasized. All eyes were now on Mary, waiting for her reaction. As she stood at the center of the curious and skeptical crowd, Mary looked directly into Daniel's eyes, her voice still calm but firm enough for everyone to hear. "Of course I'm willing to cooperate, but before you call the police I hope you'll double-check the information on my account. I don't want to cause unnecessary trouble for anyone." Daniel ignored Mary's sincere suggestion. Instead he turned sharply to Jessica, his voice now a clear command. "Jessica, call the police right now. Tell them we have a suspected fraud case with forged documents at the downtown branch." Without hesitation, Jessica picked up the phone, dialing the number while casting a victorious glance at Mary. Daniel stood there, arms crossed, wearing a smug smile as if he had just won a battle. The surrounding customers began to stir, some even pulling out their phones to record the strange scene unfolding. Mary stood there, feeling the eyes of everyone around her. Her heart seemed to weigh heavily in her chest. She wasn't angry anymore, only deeply disappointed and heartbroken. The things she had endured in the past, the contempt, the prejudice, and the injustice were now laid bare once again, but this time in the very place she had poured all her efforts into building and protecting. Daniel took another step forward, standing closer to Mary, leaning down and speaking loudly enough for those nearby to hear his mocking words. "I don't know what you were thinking when you chose our bank to carry out this act, but clearly you've underestimated our ability to manage things, Mrs. Collins." Mary lifted her head and looked directly into Daniel's eyes, her gaze still calm But full of determination, she knew that just a moment longer and all the mockery, doubt and arrogance would come crashing down before the truth she was about to reveal. Outside, the sound of sirens grew louder, drawing nearer, signaling that the tension was about to reach its peak. Daniel stepped back slightly, standing straight, his eyes focused on the door, waiting for the police to arrive and deal with the woman he believed to be a reckless fraud. Mary remained in place, her heart ready for the next moment.